inaugurate this fourth IDPPA conference in Rio for several reasons, but mainly because this conference is another step that consolidates our alliance, but more than the conference itself, the fact that this is the first time we also offered an IDPPA course to our students, which is remarkable. I remember launching this idea at our Moscow conference last year of a student workshop, and how it was enthusiastically embraced by all of you. And many of the professors gathered today here have participated in the last days in this student workshop, and will certainly agree with me that it was a very positive, this joint initiative of our alliance. And I hope it will be repeated in the future many times. I'm also very happy to meet again with dear colleagues and friends, and to have the opportunity to reciprocate the hospitality that has been offered in previous occasions. I'd like to take this opportunity also to apologize for any eventualities in the organization of the event. This can be explained to a great extent, I guess, due to the fact that we're not prepared to hold the conference in Rio this year, and thus we had to find the resources and organize the event within a time frame shorter than we desired, actually. But I must express my special thanks to two people. There are more people to thank, but especially two people who have particularly helped me over this last month. First, Robin Lewis, our great leader, master, and guru at the Alliance, for being, as always, the great articulator of the program structure, and helped us to resolve many logistical and some political questions as well. And to Veronica Azi, who you all know now personally. You know her from her emails before, for helping me taking care of the whole logistics of the event, which is nothing trivial, and who kept in constant contact with you. I must also, of course, to express my gratitude to FGV for the crucial support in terms of financial and structural resources it has provided to make this event possible. As a member since the very birth of IDPPA, FGV is happy, to contribute with this event to the further strengthening of our alliance. Well, that's it. I wish you all a great conference and a pleasant stay also in our imperfect but still wonderful city of Rio de Janeiro. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Celso, and thank you for your wonderful hospitality. This is not the first time, and it's not the last time I will mention the graciousness and the wonderful arrangements our hosts have made. Both Celso and Veronica, who is a wonder, who has gotten probably 10,000 emails from all over the world and has in the end made everything work wonderfully, and we're very grateful for this opportunity to come here to this beautiful city and to have this event. Since not all of you have been involved with IDPPA, there are some people in the audience today who are guests, and we welcome you very much. And even some of the newer members are not familiar with the organization. I wanted to say a bit about it and about its evolution. IDPPA stands for the International Development and Public Policy Alliance, and it was a germ of an idea that actually began in Beijing in 2012-13, and began with a very small informal gathering of just 4 members, the 4 BRIC countries, not BRICS at that point, Brazil, Russia, India, China, to discuss the idea of starting an alliance of policy and development studies programs. And part of the momentum for this, which we've carried forward in an expanding and growing way, was to present a different vision of public policy and of development than the one that tends to emerge from the dominant hegemonic centers of power in the United States, in Western Europe, and elsewhere, to begin to redefine public policy from a different point of view. When I was a dean, as I was for many years at Columbia University in New York at the School of International and Public Affairs, we started a public policy or public administration, it was called, program in 1977. And for the first 10 years or so, it was entirely American. It was 100% American students. Students went on only to 3 employers: the city of New York, the state of New York, the federal government. But then in the mid-80s, we started to get students from other countries, a few governments, South Korea, Mexico, and others started to send young civil servants to study with us. And a group of them came to my office one day and said, early in the semester, said, you know, it's a wonderful program. We're really learning a lot. And the study of public policy and public administration is very sophisticated here. But the case studies we're given are all American. There's no case studies from our countries that are really relevant to the context that we have. And this helped to precipitate something we were already pondering, which was how to internationalize, how to globalize the study of public policy. And that's very much one of the objectives of IDPPA. So within 5 to 6 years, we had a student body that was 50% American, 50% international, with case studies and indeed with professors from all over the world. So this is a process we are very much taking a leading role in. We also, in the 1990s at Columbia, started maybe let's call it an earlier version of IDPPA, which was called the Global Public Policy Network. But not surprisingly, the 3 founding members were the London School of Economics, Columbia, and Sciences Po Paris. And we soon saw that that was a very limited kind of palette. Our 4th member was from Singapore, the National University of Singapore. But still, that GPPN, which I was the first director of, remains very much focused on traditional paradigms, to a great extent, not entirely, I don't want to exaggerate, but traditional paradigms of the study of global affairs. IDPPA is different. We are all based in the phrase that you often hear and that's also often used, the global south, which works perfectly except for those of us based in Russia. We don't feel very south when we're in Moscow, especially in the dead of winter, but it's as good a phrase as any. All labels are imperfect. But we have all been evolving new ways of teaching, new ways of looking at the global issues that must be solved across borders and through dialogue and new solutions provided by not coming out of New York or Washington or London or Brussels, but out of the countries that we represent. You'll notice in my case, and in the case of a number of other professors that we have here, that faculties are not necessarily from the home country of the institution, that faculties have become internationalized, globalized in a very significant way. The activities of IDPPA, therefore, are continuing to expand, and we hope to add some members. There are 9 members now. They come from the 5 BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and also from Thailand, Malaysia, Turkey, and Egypt. And these are all graduate programs in public policy or development studies. They are all taught in English, and they all have both international or global faculty members and students. So that's kind of the framework. We built IDPPA in a way to be collaborative, and this is risky. We had a lot of talk about risk and uncertainty, and in a way that is not extremely costly. We all do this to varying extents as a labor of love. We don't have it's the International Development and Public Policy Alliance. We are not an association. We don't have rules, dues, and membership fees. And that was from the beginning something we all agreed upon. And it's a bit of a balancing act, and it's only through the agility and efficiency and commitment of all the members that we can keep this going in such a fashion. But so far, it's been very successful. This year, as in past years, after the conference is over today and tomorrow, we meet, just the member schools meet in a business meeting and to plan new business. And I would say that this year, it's very much of a consensus that we're going to take a leap to the next level with some new activities that we've been discussing and contemplating for a while, but haven't up to now, I think, had the means to implement. Things like student exchanges, possibly dual degrees, summer schools, collaborative training programs for government and industry. We really are at the point where we want to move to a new level of activity. And also part of our moving up in visibility and in production of useful knowledge, and I emphasize that word useful, is our publications. Our colleagues in India have been particularly generous and proactive in creating new channels for publication of both faculty and students. Yesterday, Dean Sudarshan offered the services of the Jindal Journal of Public Policy, which is going to publish student papers. And here is an advanced copy of a new book called Public Policy Making in a Globalized World. This comes out of the inspiration of our dear colleague Korel Goyman from Istanbul for a conference that he organized 3 years ago in Istanbul, where IDPPA was part of, but not the whole conference, but it focused on different perspectives on policy making and the challenge of globalization. They published an informal kind of private edition, but this is now just coming out and available to libraries and individuals. And it's a series of essays. There are 4 or 5 authors in the room and many more out there, looking at different ways of both teaching and teaching policy making and making policy in the globalized world. It's published in South Asia by the Social Science Press and distributed through Routledge and Taylor and Francis. And in fact, if you go to the Routledge site today, it's still not ready. It's unavailable, but will be within 10 days, I'm told. But I do recommend that you have a look at it and buy copies for all members of your family, pets, dogs, snakes, and cats particularly enjoy this book, I'm sure. So we would love to have that. And I would say also that the plan is to make this a series of studies in public policy in which the annual conference each year, papers will be published in a book form. So this was Istanbul 2014, we had Delhi 2015, Moscow 2016, and now Rio. So these are some of our plans for the future. The conference theme today comes from something called the Stockholm Statement, which is a bold initiative on the bahalf of a group of about a dozen distinguished economists, including 3 former chief economists of the World Bank, Kaushik Basu and Lin Yifu from China, and Joe Stiglitz, my colleague from Colombia, and others, in Stockholm in November 2016, where they attempted to reorient and refocus economists on very concrete policy guidelines and initiatives. As I said in the introduction, this is not really a blueprint. It doesn't say, here's how you do it. But what it does say to policymakers is it sets an agenda. It says, these are the things that are important. So we decided to, with the urging of some colleagues, to focus around some of the points made in the Stockholm Statement. If you haven't read it, it's referred to here, and I recommend that you do. But they made 8 different points, and we solicited papers addressing any of those. And we ended up focusing on 6 of the 8 issues. I will note that one that attracted no papers was very much of a kind of an economist's talking to economists issue, which had to do with GDP and measuring GDP. And it was a good point in policy terms about GDP being an inadequate measure of well-being, but nevertheless, we didn't get papers on that. But we have an opening panel today on inclusive development, which is really a very major theme in a lot of places. It's part, of course, of the Sustainable Development Goals. This afternoon, we have a wonderful panel on the environment, on environmental sustainability. Tomorrow morning, putting together a few of the themes like social norms and social harmony and its relation to economic policy. That's tomorrow morning. And then a final panel, and I think we'll talk about this later, all Brazilians, talking about technology and the challenges of technology, and I'll be chairing that. So we have, I think, a wonderful program, and we look forward to your attendance and participation. I think I will sit down and be quiet and let our colleagues take the stage for the first panel, which Celso is going to chair. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robin. And well, I'm glad to chair this first panel on inclusive development. So I invite my colleagues, Firoz Khan from Stellenbosch University, South Africa. Where's Firoz? Come to the table, please. And André Guzzi from FGV, Brazil. And René Rodrigues Fernandes, also from FGV. Chu Shulong from Tsinghua University, China. And Pratik Padkul from Jindal Global University, India. Have your seats. We're going to have 3 presentations of about 20-25 minutes. No, I must tell you once coming to an end, your time. And then we'll have a short coffee break and then come back for the 2 last presentations. Okay, so let's start without further ado. Yes, Firoz, you're first.
Thank you. Sorry, can I get the clicker? So I'm just waiting for the clicker for the power.
Okay, you can wait a little bit.
Nice. Okay, I think that when I looked at this Stockholm statement, I just thought to myself, is that the first question that I want to ask myself is what is the end goal of development, and how do people perceive and experience development? And then I went back and I looked at some of the classical sociological texts, and I came up with this very nice quote. Sorry that it's so wordy, but they're saying that 5 decades of development, 2 under the auspices of with the Agency of Development State and 2 inside the New World Order, has done very little to change what the UN has identified as the inequality predicament. And this is the key, this inequality predicament. And there's little to show except a tortuous history of development ideas and practices tackling to the winds of change. So in short, is that this development has been alienating and has been discriminatory and has resulted in high levels of inequality. And if you look at the post-structuralists, those who argue for alternatives to development rather than development alternatives in terms of the notion of the mainstream development, is that this is what they've got to say. And this, everybody knows what Escola. Development was and continues to be, for the most part, a top-down, ethnocentric and technocratic approach which treated people and culture as abstract concepts, statistical figures to be moved up and down in charts of progress. It comes as no surprise, though, that development became a force so destructive to third world cultures, ironically in the name of people's interests. And if you look at Escobar and you look at him later on, he said development continues to play in strategies of cultural and social domination, even if academics might have more nuanced views of what is going on today, including how appropriate development including how people, what appropriate development is there for their needs. But it's also in this context that one can speak of, in a sense, the death of development, as the way we understand it, but also its rebirth. And this was taken from the iconoclast William Easterly, when he says the following. He says, bearing in mind what I just said about development, he says, first of all, development is dead, but long live development. And he says the following: the failed ideologies of the last century have come to an end, but the new one has arisen to take their place. It is the ideology of development, and it promises a solution to all of the world's ills. But like fascism, communism, etc., and others before it, developmentalism is a dangerous and deadly failure. So this is just a little bit of context for what I'm going to say and what I'm going to say. Now, a lot of the time is that medieval theologians debated how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. And if we change the question slightly and we ask how many angels can dance to the head of the pin and also on the head of the poor, on the heads of the poor, the answers to both is that an infinite number. I mean, when the angels get on their dancing shoes, then there's no stopping them. And they ask, well, what this means for development then. So this is the development. So who are the ambassadors and the angels and the experts, the self-appointed Politburo of development? And there they are. First of all, the angels of the non-governmental mercy. Secondly, the good and great angels of government and bureaucracies and multilateral agencies. And third, of course, is the angelic academics. Right? But the point that we must understand is that some angels are more equal than others. And many of the Stockholm people are some of those angels which are more equal than others. And so they represent better ambassadors and reps. So they are better ambassadors and reps of the poor than others. But the interesting thing is that the studies of the cultural and the personality traits common to all these angels is that, and especially the economists and the engineers, is that they have an unusually strong preference for order and a distaste for ambiguity. So everything can be nicely chopped up and put into little categories. I mean, I'm not going to say any more about that. Now, so before the Stockholm statement, there's been an issue here is also is that there's a certain among these ambassadors, etc. There's a certain epistemology of certainty. And in which it speaks of closure, it speaks of recognizable answers, and it speaks of certainty. And Robin Lewis was yesterday talking about this kind of epistemology of the certainty in different disciplines. Now, so there was the 2008 Politburo. So I'm trying to talk about different Politburos. So first there was a 2008 Politburo. It was led by the Nobel laureate Michael Spence. 2 years of work by commission of 21 leaders and experts, 11 member working groups, 300 academic experts, 12 workshops, and 13 consultations to develop the World Growth Commission report. And what was interesting when it came out with this report was the following. The experts' answer to the question of how to attain high growth was the following. We don't know, but let the experts figure it out. Right? But the more important thing is that if you look at the proposals coming out of this commission, was the following. They were very slippery, naive, and vague statements. And I think an economist from second year class, could say the same thing. Some of it were the following. It's hard to know how the economy will respond to a policy, and the right answer in the present moment may not apply in the future. I mean, that's absolutely vague and completely just nonsensical. The second one was growth should be directed by markets, except when it should be directed by governments. Except, I mean, so many commissions and, And then the third one was different policies can yield different results depending on country, institutions, context, and underlying growth strategies. Again, another nonsensical statement. But I mean, this was the Politburo, Now, I want to talk a little bit about the Stockholm statement before Now, if you look at the Stockholm statement, is that the position adopted smacks too much of we, the economists, deciding what is good for them, the people, and telling the state accordingly what to do. Right. Like the Spence Commission, you find vague and ambiguous comments. So one of the comments which I picked up is that a successful response to challenges in terms of rising incomes and improving health and education lies in designing policies to harness global forces for development and steering a course towards promise rather than peril. I mean, I don't know what that means. I don't know whether or not you know what that means. The second kind of thing is that we recognize the need to acknowledge that there will not be a single prescription. I mean, this is really a highfalutin intellectual thought here. And appropriate for all economies. Cultural and social context matters. This leads to different aspirations in different society and also plays a role in determining what will work and will not work. Again, vague, slippery, naive, ambiguous. No. And then the third one is, if all countries follow pragmatic policies. I mean, what is pragmatic policies? I mean, we learned from Lewis yesterday that maybe pragmatic policies is to make it work, and to do this. So what is the pragmatic policies of balancing? But if the international community works together, right? And therefore we can tap now and to relieve the constraints of global forces. Again, is that there's no negotiation, engagement with how to relieve the constraints of global forces. Now, I want to then talk is that then how does one complementing the Stockholm Statement in the World Bank is about how to integrate growth and governance. Now I'm reaching this is about the how of power and then the how of public policy. The first one is that the challenge for development strategy is to move. This is what the World Bank says. The challenge, so I'm trying to marry the World Bank statement with the Stockholm Statement. The first one is that the challenge for development strategy is to move beyond prescribing an optimal economic policies and take a broad view of the interactions between economic, social, and political, and to identify entry points. Now, the authors propose 4 distinctive sequences where different dimensions might interact. These include state capacity building, transformational governments, good enough governance, and bottom-up development. Okay, and this is all the buzzwords and fuzzwords in public administration. No? But the interesting thing is that even these World Bank people argue, but the authors admit, we are aware that some readers will find this excessively sweeping, insufficiently anchored empirically, and highly simplistic. Okay, so if we don't know how we're going to grow economies, we know very little about how to actually do the necessary statecraft for this to happen. This is a slide I'm saying. So, what are the impediments to policy reform, at least according to what I see? The first of all is that, sorry, this is very small writing. I'm sorry about this. First of all, there's knowledge from the outside and outside knowledge. The West is the depositor, the depositor, the warrantor, the creator, and distributor of universal knowledge. So where is this kind of ways? And this speaks particularly to the mission of the IDPPA. Right? The second thing is that, and this is in the current conjuncture, there's a dearth of future scenarios enough to galvanize the imagination of a great number of people. But complementing this is a mingling of structural power of both colonialism and world system forces, which see the ascendancy of mega projects and which sustain national development planning. Okay. I'm going to skip this slide. Sorry. And the last one is the way that imperial governance is the way that international financial institutions and NGOs have implicated themselves and imbricated themselves in the very structure of the state, is that denying or what is constraining policy reform. I'm going to end quickly on this slide. Some closing thoughts. There's a tale of 2 adjustments. Is that when the developing countries when the developing countries faced the same or even lesser circumstances of the 2007 and 8 financial crisis, the Bretton Woods institutions demanded that, or rather the Bretton Woods institutions imposed deflationary measures on these economies, which were already in crisis. But the interesting thing is that, but post the 2007 and 8 financial crisis, the developing countries confronting similar circumstances stimulated and reflated their economies by quantitative easing and a whole range of all things. But what was interesting is that these measures were unprecedented. And in the history of capitalism, but also way beyond the strictures and principles of the Stockholm Statement. So you see this prejudice, on the one hand, you deflate, and with structural adjustment, on the other hand, when you face the same crisis, you're reflating. So I would argue just on the way forward then, that drawing on this unprecedented kind of action in the history of capitalism and the experience of India and China, who bucked the international, who bucked the Washington consensus, perhaps there's a time now for us to readjust our maladjusted economies in ways which are more dynamic and beyond the Stockholm Statement. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Firas. Okay. And now we have the presentation of André Guzzi from FGV Brazil.
All right, good morning, everyone. So I'm going to talk about the Stockholm Statement, and I'm going to focus on the implementation of policies in post-conflict and poor countries. So this is my research agenda, so that's what I wanted to do, was try to look at the Stockholm Statement and try to see the policies that are implemented in these particular areas, in these particular contexts, to understand what are the possible contributions that the statement can do in order to improve the practices that exist nowadays. So just to show how I'm going to make my presentation. The question of my presentation is, how have the norms of inclusion and sustainability affected international development aid in general? So not only looking at the Stockholm Statement, but in general. And my argument is that the norms have advanced international development towards policies with greater attention to social and human aspects. But when we look at the practice, we see that the actions still lag behind. And when we see this difference between the norms being advanced and that actors are discussing more these ideas of inclusion and sustainability, but the practices are not following these norms that are being used, it left us wondering why there is this disconnect between the norms and what is being said internationally and the practice that happens on the ground. So this is what I'm going to discuss. Just to give a roadmap of the presentation, I'm going to start just explaining the norms, so how the norms of inclusion and sustainability were created in this international development environment. Then I'm going to look at the practice, and in order to understand a little bit more the practice, I'm going to focus on the social protection mechanisms that were implemented in poor and post-conflict countries, especially in Africa. And then in the end, I'm going to try to explain one of the reasons why there is this disconnect between the norms and practice, and will be, as you're going to see, similar to some of the points that were presented by the previous presentation. So just to start, as we know, norms, or the ideas of norms, are the basis of collective expectations that the international development actors have from each other, and play a key part in directing the actions of actors involved with international development as well. So in this sense, when we think about norms, we are going to think about the ideas or the principles that are basically the ones that all different actors use and have in common, and they understand the final goals of their actions and their behaviors. So when we look to the particular actions of international development actors since the 90s, we're going to see that inclusion and sustainability are basically terms or ideas that are used by all of these different actors. Even when they use or create programs or policies that don't have one particular notion of inclusion or sustainability, it is going to be somehow shaped or modeled in a way that is going to be justified as being a policy that is implemented because it has an inclusion and sustainability factor. So there is this great enthusiasm of these two ideas of inclusion and of sustainability. And basically, if you look at any reports of international development actors today, it's hard to see that if they're going to discuss development, that they are not going to include the words inclusion and sustainability in their reports in particular. So there is this kind of agreement, this kind of notion that inclusion and sustainability are the central goals, are the central norms that guide the actions that are going to happen on the ground. Although the Stockholm Statement makes it clear the idea that the inclusion development should be something that will lead or will guide the policies of international development actors, from now on, we see from through a historical background that sustainability and inclusion are actually ideas that have been in this system for a long time. And here I just give some of the examples of since when these notions of sustainability and development have been used. So in the 70s, the World Bank started to implement projects, and invest projects for to improve poor communities in developing countries. And the idea of these programs were also based on the notions of it's important to create a development that is more based on the poor, that is more progressive, that is related to human capacities. In other words, it was already using some of the ideas or the notions that are the basis of inclusion and sustainability since then. Then in the 90s, again, since we have this gap in the 80s, that most of the policies were developed based on the trickle-down development theory, which focuses only on the economic growth. Since the 90s, we do have a lot of policies and actions that started to be done using these definitions and these terms of inclusion and inclusion and sustainability as well. So this is just to show you that these terms are something that have been on the agenda of international development for a longer time. When it comes to the Stockholm Statement in 2016, what could be then the advantages for the development of the norm? We could say that the first point is that it would just reinforce what has already been said. So the idea of having one more principle or one more statement that says what we already know in terms of development or should be focused is just this idea of reinforcement of a norm that still has some difficulties to be applied in practice. And another point is also that given who is part of this epistemic group that developed the Stockholm Statement, we could also consider that this norm would also be taken into consideration by those who didn't take these points into consideration until now. For example, the more traditional international financial institutions and more traditional donors who tended to focus until then on more of a trickle-down development. Well, so after that, after the idea of norms creation, how are these norms translated into policies, right? How are the points, how can we identify how these norms or these ideas are then implemented on the ground? Well, there are several authors, and there is a great literature that discusses different reasons why this practice lags behind the norms that are implemented. There is one challenge that I find it's particularly interesting to talk about when we discuss the idea of sustainable and inclusive development, which is the difficulty of the international actors in shaping policies and programs that are able to translate those particular ideas of inclusion and sustainability on the ground. And in order to make this idea a little bit clear, I'm going to give the example of the schemes of social protection in poor and post-conflict countries that I discussed before. Just for you to have an understanding of these social protection mechanisms mean, They are specific actions on the ground, and they can be divided into the social insurance. So when you provide assistance to the population based on particular risks or adversities that they might face during their lives. And it can also be social assistance when you provide assistance to those who are in the poorest extracts in the population. These kinds of strategies or these kinds of policies that are considered social protection policies have been adopted by many different international development actors as well. So even the IMF nowadays considers or talks about the importance of implementing social protection programs. And one of the reasons or one of the justifications of using the social protection as one of these mechanisms is because it is inclusive and is sustainable, because you are providing the assistance directly to those individuals who need the assistance. So you are providing the assistance for the individuals, for the human being, and not thinking that especially on the economic growth first, as the trickle-down economics used to say before. So just to give you an idea or in a sense of how much these social protection programs have been implemented throughout the world, this is one map of Africa that shows the countries where you see some implementation of these particular programs that are called social protection. And so just for you to understand what these colors mean, the dark gray is not part of the study, the north of Africa. The middle gray are the countries that the authors from the World Bank identified these social protection programs being implemented. And the light gray are the countries that have not implemented one kind of social protection until now. So as you can see, you have basically 39 countries in Africa that already have this kind of social protection programs being implemented. Of course, that these programs, what this map is showing to us here is not indicative of how far these programs have reached or if they are actually ingrained into the national scope of public policy. But what they are showing is that in all of these countries, you have at least the initiation of programs that are related to social protection. And most of the programs here are programs of cash transfer or in-kind transfers to the poorest population. Some of them being conditional and others not being conditional. So just to make a little bit clear of how much these programs have advanced in a continent, there is another study of social protection in Africa that shows how much actually countries adopt or have an initial idea of implementing these programs, and then the difference of how much of these programs you see being actually executed in Africa. So just for you to understand this table here, the first bar shows that there are, out of these 22 countries that were studied, the blue bar shows how many of them have started to implement social protection programs. The three bars at the bottom, they show that from the 22 countries, the blue bars are the ones that actually executed these social protection programs and have them actually being happening in these countries. And you see that the blue bar is much, much lower, more than 1/3 of the bar from the first, for the first one. So in other words, it means that the idea again is to try to implement or to create the idea that it's necessary to implement these policies, but when we look at them and see if they are actually being executed, we see that there is a huge limitation of programs that are being executed, in fact. So given this difference, I wonder what is happening, right? What are the problems that we have? That we have so many programs that are being initiated, but we don't have that many programs that are being executed. So in order to identify this explanation, in my research, I looked at many different reports on all of these different social protection mechanisms that were implemented, and I tried to understand through the reports the reasons why, or the reasons that were given to justify the challenges for these programs for not being implemented. One point that is necessary to highlight here is that in all of the reports, which are written and developed by international development actors and international agencies like NGOs, they bring the notion that it is a positive and a successful kind of mechanisms that should be implemented. So they believe in the feasibility of these programs to actually work on the ground, even in this context of countries that are extremely poor and that have a very poor infrastructure. Successes vary from one country, from one program to another, but the challenges that they identify are basically the same in all of the different countries that they find these programs. And the challenges are that the recipient countries end up becoming too reliant and too dependent on the international donor support, not only the financial support, but also the technical support to implement these programs, that there is a lack of commitment from the national government to providing funds to these programs. Most of these programs are a joint funding from the government and international donors, so then you see this problem coming up. There is the precarious infrastructure of these countries make it hard for these programs to actually achieve or reach those who need it the most. So in other words, those who benefit from these programs of social protection end up not being the poorest. In other words, these programs are not necessarily that progressive, and progressive is one of the premises of a program to be inclusive. So we have a problem here in a way that it is implemented, it already shows the difficulty of implementing those initial principles that we talked about. And then in the end, another point that it is usually highlighted is that it serves just to a very tiny percentage of the population because of this difficulty of identifying mechanisms to reach the population in general, and because of the funding that is scarce and that these countries don't usually have to finance them. So with these points in mind, then the norms that are there and these challenges and these difficulties, why there is this disconnect? Why there is this disconnect of how these policies are being shaped and the ideas that these authors have that underline the creation of these policies. One of them is what was already said, is the idea that most of the assistance is top-down. But the idea of top-down in this term is not only the fact that these policies come from the outside, but that the shape was created by outside donors as well. And due to the fact that they are created by the outside donors, there is a greater difficulty for these policies to be implemented on the ground. So instead of creating policies based on the realities of the places, the policies are created first, and then they are adapted or accommodated to try to be implemented on the ground. Hence, there is this problem of trying to reach, excuse me, the inclusion and the sustainability of these programs. The other point is that some countries that are not that attached to international development actors or development system, given that they are not that close to the sources of funding or even the ideas or the norms that exist outside, they are more resistant in adopting these kinds of policies because they are shaped by the outside. And then the third point that is important for both of the scenarios, both in the case that you have an assistance and the case that countries that don't have the assistance, it's the fact that we needed to recognize that in these countries, we do have political elites which are connected to economy, and that the provision or the creation of policies that are redistributive or that are inclusive may harm or affect their source of wealth. So it is also important to consider not only the necessity of implementing inclusive policies, but it's also important to understand or think about measures that would try to change the thinking of the local political elites that are so resistant in providing also inclusive and redistributive programs. So as a conclusion here, in putting all of these points together, the first point that it's necessary to highlight is that the Stockholm Statement brings together important aspects of social development. and it represents an important aspect in the process of the dissemination of the norm, as I said. But when we think about the international development aid, we needed to consider that it's still necessary for the actions to be implemented, that they take into consideration more of the local aspects and take also into consideration the voices and interests of those who are the local or those who will be affected by those policies. Otherwise, we are going to have policies that can be considered progressive in the terms that they talk about inclusion, they talk about sustainability, but they continue to be policies that are top-down and that don't address necessarily the problems that exist in the local areas where these international donors act. Okay, so these are my points. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Thank you very much, André. And now I pass to my colleague from FGV, René Rodrigues Fernandes.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be here. It's a great honor to present at this conference, at IDPPA conference. And before talking about the specifics in my presentation, I think it's nice to highlight my work in the field of entrepreneurship, because it has a shift in between the 11 years that I've been working with it. And I believe it matches with the thinking on IDPPA because it changed over time. So back 11 years ago, when I started working with entrepreneurship, I was developing programs that would try to foster innovative entrepreneurship. I was running business plans competitions. I was teaching entrepreneurship under the Schumpeterian idea that it should have innovation all the time, talking all the time with venture capitalists, and I would say that it was a bit over the romantic view on entrepreneurship, that creative destruction can provoke development. Well, over time, I started working more with public policies on entrepreneurship, and I saw that there was a large part of the population that was not really entrepreneurs because they had a great idea, because they had a new entrepreneurial venture, but they were just making their day-to-day living. They're struggling because they didn't have jobs, especially in developing countries or in poor countries. So the only way they had was to become entrepreneurs. So we couldn't see entrepreneurship in the Schumpeterian sense that innovation was central, but surviving was central to these people. And I started questioning this romantic view. So that's why I keep asking myself, and that's not, there's not an answer for this question, because I don't believe we can use the concept of creative destruction to create inclusive development for the poor. We have to shape our policies to create development to these people. So these are the entrepreneurs we see here in Brazil in the soap operas. Brazilian soap operas are world famous, and I think they represent well how we see the reach, the people that start big companies, but that's actually not the reality of the Brazilian population. This is actually the reality of the Brazilian entrepreneur. This is the barefoot entrepreneur using Max Neef's concept. So this is the guy you find on the corners of the streets, selling everything you can want. You may find sweets, you may find charger for your mobile phone, you may find even toys to bring home to your kids. And they're basically working to survive. They're going to the streets and working to survive. And our agencies and our policies on entrepreneurship, they are not focusing on this type of people. Just go a little deeper on the Brazilian reality. 4 out of 10 Brazilians are considered entrepreneurs. They're involved in starting or running a business. 60% had their total family income up to 3 minimum Brazilian wages, which is about $220 nowadays. 94% didn't have tertiary education. They didn't get a bachelor. 30% had almost no education at all. Only less than 40% were white. The vast majority were informal. Only 21% declared to have some kind of registration, and 17% had the CNPJ, which is the Brazilian tax ID, which means that 83% are actually informal. 83% of Brazilian entrepreneurs are informal. And when they were asked if they received any kind of support for any organization, nearly 86% said no, we didn't receive any kind of support from organizations. Public policies on entrepreneurship, they can be separated in between policies focusing SMEs and focusing really entrepreneurship in the Schumpeterian and the entrepreneurial sense, which bring us to this romantic view of development. And what I've been seeing is that most of the policies that we have been developing, they are focusing more on quality, they're focusing more on individuals, high impact firms, gazelle firms, enabling people to become entrepreneurs or high impact entrepreneurs. But we don't see too much policies on the other side, on the SME policies, and especially policies focused on these people who don't have formalization, in these people who are actually just self-employed because they need it to make their living. Focusing more on quantity, on helping them develop firms, on supporting them, and how basic things, how to separate their personnel to their companies, accounting, and this type of things. And looking at the usage of government funds in Brazil over the last 4 governments, like since 2002 with Lula, first term, Lula second term, Dilma first term, and now recently Dilma and this new president Temer. We've seen that the government has been increasing the usage of funds to finance big companies. So the light yellow is the funds that goes to policies in Brazil like Bolsa Família, Vale Gás, for housing, and others for helping poor people. And it lost its importance over time, and nowadays the money that goes to big companies goes to more than 50% of the usage of government funds in recent years. Based on this, I decided to perform a critical discourse analysis on the 2 main agencies that are helping entrepreneurs and companies in Brazil, which are SEBRAE and BNDES, the National Development Bank. SEBRAE is not part of the government, although it receives money that comes from the government and comes from the part of the salary that people receive goes to the Federation of Industry. The part of the taxes the companies pay, they go to the Federation of Industries in Brazil, and SEBRAE ultimately receives this money and helps to foster entrepreneurship, what we'd call lifestyle entrepreneurs. And its mission is to promote the competitiveness and sustainable development of micro and small enterprises, with up to 3.6 million reais a year, which is nearly about $1 million US dollars, which we quickly see that's not the reality of those people, the barefoot entrepreneurs. And BNDES, the Brazilian Economic and Social Development Bank, is aimed at big companies, what I'm calling here glamour entrepreneurs, focusing on gazelle or big companies. And BNDES is one of the largest development banks in the world. It uses long-term financing and investment in all segments in the Brazilian economy to develop its work. So SEBRAE doesn't give any money, it just gives consultancy and training to entrepreneurs, and BNDES gives money to companies. And these are the websites for the two agencies. One of the weaknesses of the work is this work is that it was based on analyzing documents, news from 1 year, from the last year, and the website of the company. So I didn't interview people, but what we can clearly see from documents, website, and recent news ads is that both are really not focusing on helping these barefoot entrepreneurs. They are more focused on helping BNDES, namely big companies. They have programs for startup companies that developing innovative technologies. But if you enter the website, they say that they give money to micro, small, and medium enterprises, but you cannot really find a way to get these funds, to get use of these funds. When you start clicking and digging in their website, you're going to be redirected to a commercial bank that in the end will not actually give you any subsidy to help micro and small entrepreneurs. If you go to the website of SEBRAE, you can find information about how to open a company. You can find courses on management. You can find information about how to deal with personal, how to deal with day-to-day management of small companies. But they don't really talk in a way that really poor people would understand that and will feel welcome by the material that you're presenting. And I must make a parenthesis right now because this article was written 5 months ago, and yesterday I spent some time looking at the SEBRAE website, and amazingly they changed it a little, the language on the website, and now they're becoming more welcoming to poor people. So they have now videos that you can actually feel yourself part of that. So it changed over the last 5 months.
Access to your presentation before?
Sorry? Actually, the first version of this material was presented in the Critical Management Studies Conference in late May in England. So they may have seen it. And I talk to them quite frequently because the Center for Entrepreneurship of FGV in São Paulo works close to SEBRAE, but I don't believe it's a fruit of that. I believe that it's due to they sometimes they need to realize that you have to be more open, especially to this micro. There's now in Brazil a kind of company that's called micro individual entrepreneur, and that's a people who's they don't have like an actual company, but they are the entrepreneurs themselves, like this guy. So and this number is growing, and I believe they realize that they need to serve also these people. And the conclusions, the findings were that BNDES and SEBRAE, they do have the word development in their mission statement, but they still treating it in the Schumpeterian sense of development, and they still treating it as the sense that we know that developing entrepreneurship is a silver bullet for development. Both websites are not welcoming to micro and small entrepreneurs, although it has changed recently. I would say that the revenue figures for BNDES, when they say when they are talking about micro entrepreneurs, may scare micro entrepreneurs because well, we don't go up to 250 million reais, so they would not be welcoming on the web page. There's no emphasis at all in treating the have-nots or these people in the streets who are not formal, who are informal. One thing that I found on the news over the last year is that they're working a lot on reducing red tape, but reducing red tape is just part of the entrepreneurship and SMP policy, but it doesn't solve the question of these people who are informal. The agencies could be more open to empower, and André brought a term that I didn't think of it before. These policies, they are top-down, basically. So there are people in these agencies thinking about how to help these entrepreneurs, but they're not giving voice to them. So I believe these agencies could be more focused on empowering these people and ask them to develop what they need for them, and to get more explicit about what would help them to become at least more able to make their living with entrepreneurship. And I believe that these agencies they could be more focused on community-based entrepreneurship and connected to local innovations, providing people in the bottom of the pyramid with more knowledge on how to explore these new opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you. And well, I'm glad I had no problem sharing this table. We'll control the time of the presentations. Were perfect. So I think it's better to have a time here for some questions and answers. What do you think, Robin? And not to have 5 presentations and then questions. Are you okay with that? So I invite the floor to make questions. I just ask you to make it on microphone since it's being transmitted on the internet today. Where's the microphone? And you could please just identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Dipanshu Mohan. I teach courses in development economics back in India. Andre, my question is addressed to your presentation. You presented on the issues of norms and its relationship with the practice of social protection programs. The question seems to be addressing 2 points. I guess you can delve a bit deeper on this, whether your paper addresses these. First is more on the epistemic concern of where norms come about. And I think largely you were discussing international norms on how social protection and progressiveness works. So, and this was in the Stockholm statement. So one of the limitations that can be addressed is whether norms by their very conceptual nature in this context misses out to accommodate for various values or belief systems that are contextualized to national levels, and that may be responsible for the laggard implementation scenarios that you addressed. So one could be a conceptual lag, that we're not very much looking at why or how norms can be defined. So I was a bit not clear on that. The second point is, if you're talking about progressiveness in terms of the implementation program, the practical application of norms, which is given through policies, are policies then in their case being defined not nationally but from a top-down perspective, not at all accommodating for the local endogenous belief systems that are a part of what is the well-being of those societies, which are based on class concerns or caste-based concerns or social hierarchies. So I guess that may just probably help in substantiating. Yeah.
Thank you. It's better to have a round of questions and then come back to the table. All right.
Good morning. My name is Bharat Dahiya with the Chulalongkorn University, Bangkok. I have two questions, one for Firoz. Firoz, you, in your own characteristic style, you tore off all the proposals that have been given as the practice we have in IDPPA. And you criticized with great sense of logic all the different statements that have been made. Now the question is, what is your take? You gave a critique of what is there, but then how do you, if you have certain proposals or certain ideas that we should brew or incubate from your personal experiences of your work and so on. And I have another question to Renee. I know you very clearly stated that it has been a work of going through literature and looking at the websites and so on. How do you see, there's two parts to the question. One is, how do you see this related to what Hernando de Soto has been talking of, financial inclusion? Okay, that unless you empower the poor through financial inclusion, all these, high-sounding Schumpeterian, if you like, things do not actually help the micro-entrepreneurs, if suppose we have to call them micro-entrepreneurs. And the second thing is that when you are looking at literature, are you looking at certain programs around the world, maybe especially in BRICS countries, for example, India, which are now including or implementing policies of inclusion by giving micro-entrepreneurs or informal sectors, the entrepreneurs, if you like, collateral-free loan, okay? Because that's a very different kind of trend. And the current government in India, at least they say that they believe in the policy of helping the poorest of the poor. So have you seen across, whether it is in Latin America, because Hernando de Soto, he was talking very much in a Latin American context. So how does that relates to what is happening elsewhere on the planet?
More question?
I'm Dina Wafa from the American University in Cairo. I'm just going to add a little bit to what was just mentioned in the previous question, and it's to Renee as well. Perhaps when looking at the point of inclusion and helping the poorest of the poor or the informal sector, there's also a problem not just with the demand and the supply side, with the issue of mistrust, perhaps, because as in like in the case of Egypt, sometimes you would find that they perhaps in the poorest, the informal sector, they would feel there would be some interference in their work, or there would be some taxes imposed. Although, of course, taxes at this point are not applicable, but with the fact that they are unaware of all policies, this is another problem with the demand side. As in the question that you showed us in the survey, that when asked if they do want assistance, you said that about 85% said no. And this no is probably coming from a fear of some interference in their lives and probable taxes and
If I
and
can
things
quickly
that
ask
they
that,
could avoid.
no, they said that they didn't receive an offer of assistance.
And that are they seeking it, or
They are not aware that there is assistance. They don't know it.
One more question. Laila?
Just a quick question about the programs targeting the poor, and why was Egypt and the other Arab countries excluded from the study? Weren't there data available? Because we have a similar program targeting the poor. Some of it works on conditional aspects, and some of it is unconditional. So I'm just wondering, isn't there any data available in English, or what's the problem? Thank you.
I think it's better now to have the answers from my colleagues. I don't have I'm sorry. One more question.
Thank you. I'm Nick Rosna from Uni Razak, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I'd like to share with you what Rene has mentioned, what Rene presented in Brazil. We have the same problem or same scenario in Malaysia as well. The government is encouraging young entrepreneurs to be involved in business. They are encouraging young graduates to be not to go for employment, but to be entrepreneurs. But the funding is not coming. So I could relate well to it. They do have the fund, but in order to get the fund, the young entrepreneur must show proof that they have a track record for at least 2 years, that they have been in business, or that they have had some deposits in the bank. But these young graduates have hardly deposits in the bank, and that's the main reason why they go to the SMEs. The only help that they get is the food truck. But it's not for the young graduates. The graduates are into business in oil and gas, into business in more significant sectors. And these are not coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Alexei Verbetsky from Ranepa, Moscow. I also have a question to Firoz, actually, and basically this may be a continuation of Baral's question, but I wonder if you think that, or if you consider it necessary for various multi-player involvement in basically closing this gap between policies and implementations that you were criticizing, and if yes, basically what are the key maybe actors that need to be engaged? And well, to me, I think that's a way to overall improvement of the situation, to get more involvement and more participatory, let's say, development practices. So basically, it's not policymakers or governments or infrastructure organizations that dictate the policies, to exaggerate, but rather something that is developed together. Again, not expertise, but rather participation and implementation through empowerment. So what are your ideas on this? Thank you.
So let's come back to the panel. I don't have a question, just want to make a comment about the role of the... Sorry. I don't have a question, just a comment on the role of the local elites as mediators, no? Because as you said, sometimes local elites may be not willing to implement this top-down programs, but sometimes they do want to implement, but with a bias, to favor their clients and not the clients supposed to be reached by those politics. Just a question to consider. Well, let's come back to our presenters. For us,
Okay. And then, you know, this paper ends, and I didn't, and left.
Please speak on the phone. Get microphone.
Hello. This paper ends on the basis which I say is that debt to development, long live development, debt to the Politburo, long live the Politburo, debt to the Stockholm Statement, and long live the Stockholm Statement. And I think, and if I put that slide in, so what it shows is that I'm also struggling with these things, but I'm saying is that the way these particular strategies reproduce themselves. And what then does become of the developing countries in terms of looking at ways forward? You know, the question that Alexia asking and Bart's asking. And the story is that I think that the lessons to be learned is, first of all, the reflation of the economies in the developed world after the financial crisis. There was a particular unprecedented kind of economic strategy that they used, which I think we can learn from. The second one is what Brazil and China did, what India and China did in terms of bucking the Washington consensus and developing very alternative growth strategies. The third particular one is that I think that one should look at what the non-aligned movement was doing. And in particular is that the way they managed to, the non-aligned movement and their economic strategies and how they tried to forge an alternative bloc. And so with coming back to Alexi's question, I think that when I was preparing this paper and I was thinking about when I was thinking about how to develop this kind of participative regime for economic policy, what's interesting is that what the Latin American and Asian experiences have been showing with respect to the non-aligned movement, was the idea was that in order to sustain different kinds of economic strategies, you need to democratize further. So you need to develop higher levels of democracy in order to sustain a particular strategy. And on that basis is that I've got no answer for you. But I do think that experiments around at the local level, as opposed to the national level, suggest ways forward. And the problem is how to scale those strategies up. So that's all I have to say.
Hello. Okay, so in terms of your question, yes, I think that there is a difference between how you analyze how the norms are formed and how then the norms, once they are created or when they affect the practice, how they're going to affect also the results of it. So just to give an example, I think that if we looked at how the norms were created, how it would help to understand these different values that we have from the international actors and the local actors. One point is the first drivers for the international development actors to change or include the ideas of inclusion and sustainability in their policies came from NGOs who in the past were criticizing these international organizations for their kind of developments that they were doing. So then they adopt those notions that were in the past criticisms of their actions, and now these become the norms that they act upon. But then what they are going to do then is to try to shape their policy in a way that at the same time that the language and the way that they are shaping those norms, those policies are based on the norms that now they include, there is still space to manage and act the way that they find it to be better, right? So I think that there is this notion of, if you consider how it is created, it is different from how it affects implementation. And the other point is that I totally agree with you in terms of if you bring a policy that already brings some sense or notion of how you develop a society, or you imagine a society, that it can cause effect because you're clashing the reality to something that is something from the imagination. So just to give an example, the social policy programs that are implemented on the ground, there are some countries that they implemented the social insurance and social assistance at the same time. And in some of the cases, and I'm talking more about the case of Mozambique that I studied more closely, fundings were given more to social insurance, to social assistance. But then if you think about social insurance, how many people in Mozambique, for example, have a formal job? Or how many people there can get their assistance through a period of time that they work? It's clear that based on the demographics of the country, that people who need more focus is the poor people, so it's through social assistance. But you still see that the provision of assistance, there is a balance between social assistance and social insurance. So then this also comes to your question about how the actors, the local elites, end up favoring some groups and the others. Well, if you receive this social protection as a huge package that you are going to implement, and you're still able to shape it to favor one particular group and not the other, then it comes the reason why you would favor to provide more fundings or more attention to social insurance and not to social assistance, for example. So yes, there is the interest of elites to implement the social protection, but the interest changes again, and it channels to particular groups of the population and not most of the time to the population that actually needs it. Okay. In terms of the data, I got that information from a report that talks about sub-Saharan African countries. So that's why they exclude the Northern African countries from the data set. But they do recognize that there are social protection programs in those countries as well, right? The countries that they show that there isn't social protection are those ones in light gray that was in a map. Okay.
Oh, thank you for all the questions. And I think I'll go from the comment of Professor Celso and back to the first question, which is maybe easier, the easiest way. So talking about local elites, what I believe when we are developing public policies on entrepreneurship, and that goes to the point that you mentioned, I believe they're actually interested in reducing poverty, because it's not nice to have poverty. It's not nice to have people who are not inserted in the consumption market, according to even a neoliberal view. But I don't think they're really concerned about reducing inequality. Inequality is fine. Inequality is what keeps the elites in power over time. So when Malaysia, when Brazil, and that goes to maybe your second question, when Chile and many other countries, they are developing policies on entrepreneurship. They're actually putting a social economic cleavage to develop these programs. So people who already have some money will have access to training, will have access to more money. That's happening in Brazil. That's happening with Startup Chile. You need to have a good idea. And as you just said, it's happening in Malaysia too. So, I don't think we're gonna go further with public policies in entrepreneurship when we're still reproducing this model of giving more money to people who already have money. I really think that we need to start addressing these barefoot entrepreneurs and start to talking more with the people, as you said, on the talking about the demand and supply side. Well, and here in Brazil, this program that I spoken during the presentation, the micro individual entrepreneur. This program is really interesting because you don't pay too much taxes. You pay around 60 reais per month, which is around like $18 or $15, just to become formal, to have access to social care, to have access to justice, to be able to open a bank account. So the amount of money that you really pay in order to receive all these benefits here in Brazil with this micro individual entrepreneur program, it's really low. The thing is, I believe it's not well advertised to these people who need or could be using this benefit of this this formalization through the micro individual entrepreneur. That could be lack of importance in the government, but also these agencies could be helping them to see more of that. Responding to your second question, this research is actually part of a bigger research where I look other programs all over the world, like Startup Chile. I'm questioning myself if I should put the Indian case of the loans with collateral or not, because it's been widely studied already. So there's a lot of literature about that. So, but yeah, that's part of a bigger research. And regarding your first question about Hernando de Soto, I think he's in a more neoliberal framework, which is completely unfamiliar to me, so I cannot answer too much about that. I know that he addresses that people should become formal in order to receive benefits and be part of the formal economy, but I'm not really familiar to his work.
Thank you. Well, still have time for more questions. Sorry, we still have time for more questions from the audience.
Hi, my question is for Renee. My name is Tony Darling. I'm from the United States, but I'm with the RENEPA delegation in Moscow. I'm curious about, so I'm not speaking from any point of true expertise here. I wrote one growth diagnostics report on this for a course last year. I'm no expert on the Brazilian Development Bank by any means, but I did do one research project on it last year. And I'm curious about if the access to finance from the development bank for barefoot entrepreneurs is really answers the whole picture, because I'm just imagining if a barefoot entrepreneur is given access to sub-market rate loans, what do they do with it, right? In the sense of what sort of goods and services are they providing? And even if a couple entrepreneurs are able to scale up their operations, maybe open a chain of stores, for example, that's good. But judging by the sheer rate and number of people that are in these competing industries, I feel like providing finance to everybody won't be a very efficient allocation of capital, both financial capital and of human capital. And market interest rates in Brazil are very high, which says to me that the returns on investment projects at the middle to higher level in corporations must be very good. So my question is, maybe instead of focusing on providing access to these loans for so many of these barefoot entrepreneurs, is possibly another part of the solution to find a way to stimulate investment in larger corporations to focus on moving some of these barefoot entrepreneurs out of the informal sector and into the formal sector of the economy. So essentially, is it a finance problem, or is it an access to training and formal jobs problem?
Okay. Well, there's a very interesting...
One more question.
Sorry.
I'm Kaan from Turkey, Istanbul, Sabancı University, IPC. It's just actually, since you're interested in these things, in Turkey, there is a institution for small and medium-sized companies, or for companies yet to come. They provide not only better terms in loans, but they also provide grants to those individuals who wish to join the formal economy, start producing their small-sized businesses. which in turn is in line with the government's plans for economy for specific places. They also provide good videos, good applications, but they're all in Turkish. So, but with Little Help, maybe you could also reach to that website and find out if that could help your research.
Sorry?
With Little Help, maybe this could also help your research.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll talk to you personally then, and then get the direction to their website. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lia. I'm a master's student here in FGV São Paulo. And my question, I studied law and development there. And 2 weeks ago, we had one event there with David Trubeck about transplant from institutions to the north of the south. I want to ask Andrea about that. If you see in your research, there should be one way doesn't work all these social assistances because they coming from institutional transplants from another countries. And for René, I want to ask if this B organizations, BNDES and SEBRAE, should be different way if they start to listen and the population to what exactly they want to have investments and maybe by conferences or another way. You know, Brazil is have a lot of creative ways to make business. You could show for us, but if we can have this opportunity to listen to the population, the civil society should be different. These organizations make investments for this population. These are my questions.
Okay, so
thank you for the questions and for the information about the Turkish. Formal versus informal versus jobs. Ultimately, I believe that these people who are living as barefoot entrepreneurs, they're only doing it because they have no opportunity at all in life. So basically, if the economy had a chance for them to be inserted in the formal market, if they had qualification, if they had study to be inserted, they would actually be looking for jobs and not they. I don't believe people would like if they had more information, if they had been raised in a different social environment than they did, they would be on the streets making their day-to-day living or carving out their living. So basically, I don't think that only giving money, subsidized money to them may be a long-term solution for these poor people. Although we see that many of the money is going towards big companies, they don't really go back to the state. So there's a very interesting book by Professor Mariana Mazzucato. I don't know if you are familiar with that. She studies money that is borrowed by BNDES here in Brazil to big companies and to innovative companies, and she tries to prove in the book that most of this money they go to big companies or they go to innovative companies, but they don't return in taxes into the state in the future. So it won't help other social programs to take these people out of the poverty. So I believe that in the very first moment, it may be good to not give this money to big companies and give money to these poor people. Whatever they're gonna do with this money is better than giving to big companies that won't give back to the rural population, and in the ultimate case won't help to reduce inequality in the country. It may be like an indirect social distribution program, just like that. But yeah, the point is not giving more money to big companies anymore. Regarding your question, I come from like my day-to-day work is in a social organization. I work with bicycle advocacy, and I believe the only policies that work it for helping people use bicycles in the city, like building bike lanes, building parks, place to park your bicycle, and all this type of things, they should come from the desires of the people who are actually using this mode of transportation. And I believe that all should be like that. So people who need financing, they should be involved in building the program to give finance to them. People who need the healthcare, they should be involved. Government should be not like back to Schumpeter again. He would say that people should go and vote and then forget about government for 4 years. And I don't believe in that. I think we should be as much as we can participative in developing public policy. So yeah, I think that if people were more involved in developing these programs, they would be different from what's right now.
Yes, I came across policy diffusion, policy emulation, and in fact, when international development actors talk about the implementation of social protection policies and cash transfer programs in Africa, they say that they are emulating the cases or the successful cases in Latin America, and then they use the case of Brazil, Mexico, Colombia as the examples of these successes. And then when they look at Africa, they say, well, South Africa was a good example of a cash transfer program in a continent. Well, the obvious problem of this kind of emulation is the difference in the context, in the economy, in the politics, in the infrastructure of these countries. So if you are going to implement the same kind of program like Bolsa Familia in Mozambique, for example, well, you have to take into consideration all the difficulties that this country has in order to implement it. So the infrastructure, how you're going to deal with the fact that to access these communities is going to be very hard and expensive activity. Who is going to finance it? Are the international actors going to finance this program for a long term, or just for a year, or just for 10 years? So what is going to be the purpose of these programs? All these questions needed to be addressed at the same time that you transfer one program from one country to another, because of these very different contexts they have. And even if the contexts were not that different, you still have to take into consideration the politics of it, right? Who are the political parties, how they take into consideration the money that they have in order to fund those particular programs. And these programs now, they are funded through the budget of the state. So they follow the OECD principles of what they do with social protection is that they fund a particular budget of social protection of the national state. And then they are in charge of channeling those funds to the implementation of the programs. So then you add one more problem there, because then if there is any kind of corruption or any problem with that money, that it's not going to that problem, then the international actors are going to say, well, the problem of this is because of those particular actors, not because of how we are shaping or designing the policies. So you see, and then it changes the focus of the discussion. So yes, it is important to emulate successful cases, but this emulation needs to come with a lot of studies and research and analysis of how you should transform those policies to fit into these different societies. Okay.
Thank you, André. Feroz, would you like to add something?
I think that the new debates around growth strategies are saying is that, and this ties in with your point, is that the route into economic development is via social development. It's via social development, and it said that what happens is that you create a virtuous cycle. But normally, if it's through economic development in order to reach social development, it creates a very vicious cycle. So, I mean, that was just a response earlier to Bharat, but also a response to kind of the social security and relationship to economic development.
Okay. So, before a short break for coffee, I just ask Veronica to make two. Oh, sorry. One last question.
Thank you. This is Francisco Vermelho from Moscow. And my question is to René Rodrigues. And why not to consider keep giving money to big companies, but tax them more? I mean, actually, all the incentives of these people, which comes from subsidies, I mean, the money has to come from somewhere. If we decide to reduce the loans or the support for big companies, then the people wouldn't have any type of incentives to become formal. And actually, that's the problem in Mexico, because people, the moment they start to be formal, they have so many regulations against them that it's not even profitable.
More questions? No. Okay.
So let me see if I completely understand that. You're saying that if we cut the money going to subsidizing big companies or increasing the taxes for them, right?
Sorry. So microphone, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, big companies have a larger capacity to create wealth, to transform supports into more money than to disperse it into mid-level capacity companies. So essentially, if we could, I mean, create a system with an asymmetrical proportion of support and tax collection, then this could go to subsidies for these people. So the issue is to tax more the rich, but support the rich.
But it's still supporting the tax more, but it's still supporting the rich.
Yes.
Well, I'm actually trying to see the logic behind that, because if you're still supporting, then you're not anytime, like as I said in the book by Mariana Mazzucato, you don't see in any time they becoming responsible for more innovation. For instance, what she puts in the book is that most of the investment in very risky innovations, for instance, is done by the government. So big research they're starting in the academy, so in public institutions funded by agencies in the United States. I would say like DARPA. She mentions the case of the DARPA agency, and like you're giving subsidized money to companies that are already rich, and they're having most of their risk mitigated by money that was fostering research that gave them things like the iPhone screen that was basically funded by DARPA, and you're still giving money then. I don't see the point on that. I believe that a way to reduce poverty is really putting more taxation, but yes, reducing the incentives to them to rely on public money,
but yet
all the time. On the other hand, if you give the poor people money to start their businesses, to maybe like buy their first shop or their first cart to sell food trucks and in the streets or this kind of things, maybe more people will see, well, we can become entrepreneurs. Maybe one day we can become a big company. I don't think that would hinder people from becoming entrepreneurs.
But yet the ratio of subsidies to go to big companies is significantly slower than the amount of money they do. I mean, the problem is how they keep it.
Sorry?
And the problem is how they keep this money. And if we manage the state to take from a symmetrical system of taxes, then this money will go to a wider distribution. Because I mean, the money has to come from somewhere.
From more taxation,
Yes.
yes, but big companies don't really need that. They're making big profits.
Then reduce them.
Okay, thank you. Veronica?
Hi, everyone. So we would like to apologize if the Wi-Fi password wasn't here earlier enough. But right now, we're going to the coffee break. So you can get a program in case you didn't get one at the registration desk. There will be 2 girls, one on each side. So as you go on your way to the coffee break, you can get another program, okay? And we are projecting right now the Wi-Fi password to the screens. Tomorrow, the password will change. It will be the same network, but the login information will change. So we're going to project it tomorrow morning before the conference starts. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have thank you. A short break, 15 minutes, and then come back to our last 2 presenters.
Eu vou deixar aqui. Tá bom.
She was working before previous president Dilma. I can't name it, but yeah, most of the parts of the my work for about giving money to against giving money to
Let's go to the coffee.
I actually like calling it entrepreneurship because it takes it from the Schumpeterian view of entrepreneurship.
I don't want to mix it up. It's a right. It's a right. He doesn't work one day. He doesn't eat that day.
Oh, sure.
My battery died just in the middle of the comments.
Shame, I heard you.
How am I going to write all these comments? How am I going to remember them?
Some of the comments were very long as well.
Yeah. But I thought you. Well, I've seen much more.
No, no, completely. I'm just saying without a pen, it's going to
Oh
be,
yeah,
it's going to be a
that's
crisis.
yeah. Even if it's short, without a pen.
But this opinion is too large.
I'm sorry?
I said the auditorium is just too large.
Yeah, it is, right?
Hoje está tendo a votação da denúncia lá do tema, né?
Ah, é hoje, né?
Mas é, agora eu lembrei, será que
Gente, é verdade.
ainda temos...
Peraí, hoje é quarta, né? Hoje é quarta, é verdade. Será que
não,
coisas...
então...
Dito que andam as coisas, né?
Hoje, segunda denúncia, sabe? É, o relator está falando. O relator vai contra. É pela rejeição da denúncia. Os advogados contra 25 minutos. É, vai ser.
Esqueci o dia todo, né?
Acho que é parte.
Não, com
A verdade
certeza.
é que até o PT está conferente, né? Coisa pública, eles também não sabem o que fazer agora.
Exato, não tem vantagem para nenhum partido assumir agora.
Entendeu? Sem certeza é boçal.
Exato. Isso acaba afetando 2018, né? Melhor manter, cadê os partidos acham?
Sim, é absurdo.
Enfim, né?
Okay, let's go back to this first panel, the second part of this opening panel. So I invite our colleague Chu Shulong from Tsinghua University in China to make his presentation.
Okay, thank you. I have prepared a talking paper, but not the PPT. So let me talking my major ideas. Equality and inclusive development has been an ideal dream and a development goal for every society in the world for a long time. To my view, I think the world, human beings, have done a great effort to achieve that goal for a long time. I see that in the largest sense, there are two major approaches in the last century, 100 years to achieve the goal. One is socialism. Socialism, from the philosophy, ideas, and the political system, try to have an equal society, that everybody is equal. But the latter efforts has been failed. We know that the Soviet Union, China, East European countries failed to achieve the goal. Yes, they were equality in those countries, but they was poor development. Everybody is equally poor. And today, there are still some socialist countries try to reach those goals, like Cuba, like North Korea. And it's still basically socialism try to reach many major goals. Equality is one of them. And they are poor countries. The other major approach, I think, is welfare states. That among developed countries, we know that the European countries, Western European countries, do a lot of, take a lot of efforts. Among developing countries, we know that here, Brazil and the many Latin American countries, that try to reach equality goal, inclusive development goal by welfare states, welfare system. West European might be relatively successful in reach the inclusive development goal by welfare state, but there has been heavy burden. It's difficult to maintain. And here in Latin America, and the welfare state has not reached the goal of inequality. And the Latin American countries, including this country, Brazil, according to many statistics, are the countries that most equal, most exclusive in the world. So now I'm attend to some countries' efforts in East Asia. Given the limited time and my knowledge, I'm going to talk about Japan and China, their practice. How can countries reach the common goal, consensus goal of inclusive development? Japan, to all the international statistics, is the one with the few most inclusive society in developed countries and in the world and in Asia. You look at every number, including Gini coincident in accent, and you call education, healthy, poverty rate. Japan is quite a successful story, successful model in reaching a development, inclusive development goal. Japan, as I said, like the Gini index is low. It's lower than 0.3, one of the lowest, with Germany among developed country. Japan, you go to Japan, Japan basically does not have poverty people. Japan is not a welfare state among developed countries, but its welfare system is quite workable, meaningful to every country. Those Chinese students, our students studying in Japan, enjoy, they come back and tell us that they enjoy very well social welfare system, including medical care. When they studied in Japan, they enjoy better system than they studied in Japan, than they studied in China. And Japan has a very affordable educational system at every level, elementary, middle, high, and the level. Tuition is cheaper. And Japan has an overall medical care system, as I said. Japan is most of the elderly society today in the world, but so far there's no big problem for retirement issues in Japan. And Japan is a wonderful model to my study, my observation. But I also see Japan model is hard to be copied. Because why Japan has reached a most inclusive society in the post-Second World War? I think it's very much because of their culture. Japan is very much a collective culture. And those international studies professionals understand that Northeast Asia, I mean Japan, Korea both North and South, China, are very collective culture society. Society's value emphasize collective bodies rather than individuals. But among those three Northeast Asian countries, Japan is really most collective culture society. Like the people value about the common goals, common development rather than individual. What does that mean? That means that nobody should be too special in Japan, Japanese culture. Nobody should be too rich. So something I found for decades, I studied United States most of my time. In US, every big company has their cooperation jet plan. Even Donald Trump had that before he became president. But you go to Japan, Japan has a lot of Fortune 500 companies. None of them have co-operational jet. And the ratio between CEOs and their workers at the same company are relatively small, the difference. Not as thousands of times difference as American and some European and some Chinese corporations. It's because their cultural values emphasize equity, emphasize similarity, not emphasize specialty among people, even within our same company and the whole society. So this is very much a culture matter. And the sense, the values led to the most equal and exclusive development in Japan. So it's hard to be copied by others, even by Eastern Asian society, other Eastern Asian societies. Second, let me talk something about my country, Chinese approach. China, in the last, I mean PRC, the People's Republic of China since 1949, now is most 70 years. The first 30 years before Deng Xiaoping launched reform in 1978, China was quite an inclusive society, equal society. Everybody is poor. Everybody is equal. So there was no major difference. And that is the goal of socialism. China achieved that. But as I said earlier, the same development that China was quite poor. Equity means everybody is equal poor, including its leaders at that time. So China was a poor developing countries 38 years ago, before reform and open. And Deng Xiaoping changed the system and the policy. And Deng Xiaoping no longer emphasized equity. He emphasized efficiency. He said China should get rich. China should be modernized. China should let a few people becoming rich first. So Deng Xiaoping departure from socialist norms, systems emphasize equity. So let's all Chinese, anybody go to China, see the change, cultural change, is because of the idea of Deng Xiaoping, because he did not emphasize equity. He just emphasized efficiency, speed, development, modernization. And therefore, in his role, his leadership in China in 1980s, and Jiang Zemin after Deng Xiaoping, his leadership in 1990s, those 20 years, China became a very much exclusive society. You read the Gini index. China, since 1979, since Deng Xiaoping launched reform, Chinese Gini index now, even today, is as high as most unequal societies like the US or like Latin American countries. It's more than 0.4. It's still. So China is not today, in the last 38 years and today, it has now been a successful story to talking about in exclusive equal development. But what I'm going to say, China in the last 20 years has made a great effort to improve the situation. So my conclusion is China is not in exclusive society yet, but China is in the right direction to reach that goal in last 20 years. And that's by two Chinese administrations. One is by Hu Jintao. He took power in China in 2002, and he proposed the new scientific development concept, still as one of the guidelines for the ruling party of China. And he was followed by Xi Jinping, who took power 5 years ago and continued his second term by the Party Congress finished the end yesterday. So Hu Jintao made 10 years efforts to improve Chinese situation of exclusive development, left by Deng Xiaoping and the Jiang Zemin administration in 20 years of reform and rapidly economic growth, and whose efforts has been followed by Xi Jinping. And what the two Chinese leadership have done so far in 15 years, Hu Jintao 10 years, Xi Jinping 5 years. See, basically they have done make 4 efforts to change Chinese situation, to make China become a more inclusive society, equal society. First, they proposed Greater Western exploitation and the Northeast Asia region development. In China, if you know something about China, the west side means middle, and the western area of China, which accounts for about 2/3 of Chinese territory. And 60% of people, including Northeast Asia, my hometown, they are relatively poor compared with the coast area from Liaoning province to Guangdong. So last 15 years, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping have made a great efforts to push the development in those relatively poor areas of China, underdeveloped. And the central government invested very much in those areas by building highways, building fast speed railways, building many airports, gave subsidies to those provinces. So now you go to China, you see the difference of infrastructure between coastal area and the inner area are gone. You go to Xinjiang, you go to Tibet, you go to Qinghai, you go to Northeast China, the infrastructure is developed, as modern as in Shanghai, Beijing, Guangdong, because of the efforts by central government, heavy investment by the government, including telecommunication situation, infrastructure. So this is the first great effort, the policy, first to reach regional equity among Chinese different areas. So because of the improvement of regional equity, then there's improvement of individual. So we go to inside China, northeast, go to west, the central part. We found that our fellow Chinese, they live bigger house than we live in the coast area. They drive similar good cars as we do in eastern areas. They enjoy good food as we do. And everything was same, including cell phones and computers they use schools because the government. Second, it called 3 countryside policy. 3 country first means agriculture sector development. Second, farmers. Third is farmer works in the urban areas. In Chinese, they call the 三农政策, 3 agriculture policy. That means central government and also require local government invest heavily to help 3 agriculture development, agriculture sector, farmers, living situation development, farmer workers working in urban areas in China. So it's a central government policy to support those 3 kind of sectors and our people in China. Because they are about 60% of Chinese, they are majority. So helping them is helping most of the Chinese. So 15 years efforts, and there have been greater progress to help them, those 3 agriculture. Third is anti-poverty. China has been highly praised by World Bank, International Organization, United Nations, scholars in the world saying China contribute most in the world war against the poverty in last decades, because the Chinese development in the last decades left 700 million people from poverty. Greatest contribution to the world against the poverty. That is recognized by international community. And the last 6 years, each year China reduced 10 million people from poverty. And today's government goal, Xi Jinping government goal, is to lift the remaining 40 million Chinese people from poverty by the year of 2020. When China reached the first 100 years ago to become a relatively rich society by 2020. Xi Jinping has a famous slogan and the instruction in these years, like by 2020, no one should be left in China. No one should be in poverty in 4 years from now, by the end of 2020. So there's a serious contract between different levels of leaders, central government, provincial government, city government, county government, town government, to take their own responsibility to lift the people living their responsible areas from poverty. And each major government official at the local levels has responsibility for a village, to lift the poverty like the village by the year 2020. And this tremendous money has been invested by central local government in order to reach that goal. Fourth, last, in urban areas, last couple of years, China engaged many programs try to get reach equal development among urban citizens in China, including housing reform, like the government build a new house for the poor people, for the poor housing, and the minimum income assurance program, like the government, central, local together, ensure minimum income to every family. This is including countryside. Those efforts are still going on. Even China is in exclusive situation, there is still serious. If you read those statistics, China is still not an equal society yet. But China has been made a tremendous effort. And I believe, many Chinese like me believe that we will reach the inclusive development goal by the year of 2020 because greater efforts by the central and the local government, greater amount of money that the central local government located for those goals, for those. In other words, what is going on in today's China, including this new party Congress, the task that laid down for next 5 years. So China, so far, it's not a good story, but China make a right direction to reach the better goal of inclusive development. Let me finish here. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Shulong. And now we have the last participant of this panel, Pratik Pradkul from Jindal Global University, India.
Hello, good morning all. Today I'm going to present, as you can see, the role of corporate social responsibility in promoting inclusive development, and I'm going to present the case from India. So before we go into the main topic, I would like to give you a brief background, and I'm going to quote from the Stockholm statement that we are all referring. It says that today the global forces hold both promise and peril. The expansion of global trade and investment have boosted growth. As a result, several low-income countries have moved to middle-income status. However, at the same time, many social groups in these societies have been left behind in the path of growth and development. So what it says that though growth and development is happening, the GDP is growing, the growth rate is growing, but the growth and development is not inclusive, and therefore we need to think and come up with something, some policy solution to correct this. And yeah, I'm trying to give this solution and trying to present a case. So I'm just going to give, just present the case and trying to give some ideas before I relate CSR and inclusive development. So the concept of inclusive development, it is growth coupled with equal opportunities, creating opportunities and making them accessible to all, not just to the poor. So I'm going to, this is from ADB's, Asian Development Bank's definition of inclusive development. The second, Oxfam's definition, which goes a little further, and it talks about collaboration between civil society, governments, and private sector actors. This second definition, or the Oxfam's interpretation of inclusive development is important for me or for us, because it talks about the collaboration in between the three actors. What we can see that there is no one agreed upon definition of the one definition of inclusive development, but what we agree is that it seeks to make the opportunities created from the economic growth accessible to all. So there is agreement on this, that the opportunities should be accessible to all, and especially for the poor and marginalized, and it should not exclude. It should not be exclusionary. And also, we can say that there is worldwide consensus on the need for inclusive development paradigm. Inclusive development, that is, first we talked about the concept or the definition, and now I'm going to talk about the Indian context. As I said, that there is worldwide consensus on the need for inclusive development model or paradigm. In India too, it's very clear that the government wants inclusive development to be there, and as a policy objective, it adopted in 2007. I mean, we have 5-year plan, so there is a there is a process by which the government of India implements its development programs, and we call it as a 5-year planning process. So the plan is for 5 years, and in 2007 there was 11th 5-year plan, and inclusive development was a main policy objective there. Then I can say that in 2015, at the plenary session of International Labour Conference, India reiterated that it is committed to securing inclusive growth. So at the international stage, India again said that inclusive development is our priority, and it is one of the objective that we follow. In 2017, very recently, I was looking at the website of Niti Aayog, so there was a planning commission, and then there was a Niti Aayog, a new body that government of India has created. So on the website or on the documents of Niti Aayog, I could see that there was an initiative named Samavesh. Samavesh is inclusion in Hindi. It says that there is an initiative named Samavesh to achieve sustainable and more inclusive development in line with sustainable development goals. So again, government of India is putting inclusive development as its main policy objective, and it's very much vocal about it. But what is the situation? So from 2007 to 2017, 10 years of period when government of India, put inclusive development as its policy objective and made it formal. 10 years of period, what is the situation on the ground? So recently, World Economic Forum launched a report that is Inclusive Development Index. So there was a report, and it ranked India 60th among 79 developing economies. So India's performance was very poor in Inclusive Development Index. We can say that even after 10 years, when government of India put inclusive development as its main objective and tried to come up with different programs, but it has remained mere an aspiration and not become a reality on the ground. So this I wanted to put in front of you. So the second component of my presentation is corporate social responsibility. So why I'm talking about corporate social responsibility now? In this slide, I'll just explain. I have given just one definition. There are definitions by European Commission, then United Nations. I have given one definition. It talks about integrating social and environmental concerns in their business operations. I'm giving this definition because I was talking to some of the participants, and I realized that CSR is not so much well-known concept in some of the areas. So I thought just to put it here. So this is integrating social and environmental concerns in the business operations. So this is CSR. So they implement various projects, social projects in the community, business houses I'm talking about. So this is corporate social responsibility. What is Indian context of corporate social responsibility? So coming from India, I can say that CSR is not a new concept there. There are business houses, big Indian houses, business houses, and they have implemented these social projects, social activities since the very beginning. So they are very strong about it. But in the very beginning, the approach was not so systematic. The approach was more philanthropic. So business houses will establish hospitals, educational institutes, but it was more philanthropy, charity. In 2013, major step or like a significant step in this area happened, and India became the first country in the world to make corporate social responsibility mandatory by law. So it is only country in the world where CSR is mandatory. So section 135, so how did it make CSR mandatory? So passing a law, that is Companies Act 2013. And section 135 and schedule 7th of that law talks about the provisions of CSR, corporate social responsibility. So section 135 prescribes the criteria for companies. So it's a it's about the profit. I mean, there is a criteria. So if a company, if that company makes a certain amount of profit over the period of 3 years, then it is eligible, or it comes under that law. So there is this criteria. And Schedule 7th, it gives list down possible activities. So there are areas under which CSR initiatives of corporates can spend money or initiate programs on. So the areas are poverty eradication, education, gender equality and women, maternal and child health, environmental sustainability, employment generation, vocational skills, etc. So in the beginning, the topic was role of corporate social responsibility in promoting inclusive development. So why I'm saying this, that why I'm making this connection. I'm taking help of a policy framework developed by Asian Development Bank. They have come up with a policy framework in which they give 3 pillars and say that if we implement or if we implement these policy solutions, and we will be able to promote or accelerate inclusive development. So what are these 3 policy pillars? Creating economic opportunities. Second policy pillar is ensuring access to economic opportunities for all. Third is providing social safety nets and social protection. So this is very much self-explanatory, but I'm more concerned about, or more, I can more relate to the second policy pillar, because it is something that I see that corporate social responsibility is able to implement or help to implement it. So you can look at the second policy pillar. It says that it is important to ensure access to economic opportunities. So you have created economic opportunities, but if there is no access, then there is no, it is of no use. Social inclusion to ensure equal access to economic opportunities by increasing human capabilities. So it's very important to raise the human capabilities, enhance them, make them capable to use the opportunities created by economic growth. So that's what I said just now, that second policy pillar talks about strengthening human capabilities to enable individuals to qualify for productive and decent employment. So that's very important, that we give them education, provide them health facilities, create an environment where they are able to access the fruits or access the economic opportunities, or ensuring equal access to economic opportunities to all. Main priorities of the second policy pillar are investing in education, health, other social services to expand human capacity. So this is the way I'm making this connection, and think that CSR in India, mandated, which is mandated by law, will be able to help in implementing the second policy pillar, or second policy pillar, or the policy solution that it talks about. With this slide, I am again going back to the definition by Oxfam. It talks about collaboration in between government, private sectors, and civil society. So for me, or for my paper, this is very important, or I think this is very important, that we should realize, our government, I mean, it has already realized, but we should realize that only government and private players can't make changes or can't promote development. It has to take help from the civil society, which is vibrant in India, or which is very distinct and prominent in India. So I have put this diagram: civil society, market, and government. These 3 players I'm concerned about. And in the second diagram, I try to conceptualize or visualize how I look at it, promoting inclusive development. So there is a law that mandates corporate social responsibility, collaboration between government, corporate, and civil society, and this efforts to ensure access to economic opportunities, and thus there will be the inclusive development will be accelerated This is how I. Something I took from the. This is the data. I mean, I was talking about the second policy pillar and the activities involved in it. So education and health, poverty eradication, rural development. These are some of the areas where. So I mean, I give you a brief idea about this corporate social responsibility when the law was passed, and it has been like 2 years, and how was the performance. So they have already spent. I'll give you some of the. So I can say that health, hunger, malnutrition, and then second was education, livelihood, rural development. These three areas were the first three areas where corporates in India spent the highest amount since 2014. So 2014 to 2015, 15 to 16, these 2 years, financial years, and 2.8 billion US dollars were spent on CSR initiatives. And as I said, these were the three sectors on which corporates spent the most amount. There was like 1,018 corporates which did not comply with this law, and government sent notices to them. So there's still a lot of things to do, but this is why I want to emphasize on that the corporates are spending money on these sectors which are crucial to ensure access to economic opportunity, the second policy pillar that I was talking about. And as I said, the 3 million NGOs in India, not all of them are, I mean, reputed or accredited, but still there is a lot of scope to improve, and that's what I want to present here. Again, I'm giving you the very recent data. Education, so it's not very clear, but education, vocational skills is the first area, then hunger, poverty eradication, health, rural development were the three sectors in 2017 also where the corporate spent the most amount, the highest amount. So why I'm so much concerned about the role of civil society. So I mean, this has taken from one of the documents, but I can say that civil society can play these many roles and help the government implement programs of a role of advocate, service provider, expert, capacity builder, incubator, representative, citizen champion. So I mean, because I myself worked in NGOs and have this experience, so I'm very much can relate to it. But there are some suggestions how we can go ahead and realize this goal of accelerating inclusive development. So these are many points, but you can see that I'm talking about role of universities along with role of NGOs, because universities are pool of knowledge with professors, researchers, so they can come up, they can help devising new solutions, policy solutions, with the help of funds that are coming from corporates, and creating regional hubs in different regions in India to coordinate activities of CSR, prevent duplication of interventions. Then regional CSR hubs should conduct training programs, so building capacities by conducting training programs, and the same, that conducting capacity building programs for NGO workers. So these are the suggestions that I give. So this is the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratik. So, time for questions. Corel first. The microphone, please.
Thank you. Korel from Sabancı University and Istanbul Policy Center, Turkey. We had a very interesting discussion, and so far most of the speakers dwelt upon the individual barefoot, the individual poor individual. Professor Shulong mentioned the collective nature of relationships in some of the countries. I'd like to suggest that there can be a place for traditional networks, traditional institutions, and some of the newer social relationships in helping with this problem, particularly in countries where there is fast migration and an unintegrated society. In this case, some of the collective mechanisms that you have mentioned in different countries, of course, taking different shapes and forms, can play an important role. Just to give you one example from Istanbul, Istanbul had a population of 900,000 in the 1920s. Now it has a population of 16 million. And according to the latest studies, only 1/3 of the Istanbulites were actually born in Istanbul. So it means that during the past 6-7 decades, people from mostly Anatolia, the hinterland, but also from outside of Turkey moved to major cities and particularly Istanbul. Here, of course, you have got a perfect setup for, if not absolute poverty, at least relative poverty in the case of Turkey, which is widespread. The figure for the country is around 17% of relative poor. Now, after this background, one of the mechanisms used in Turkey to alleviate this situation, to help with this situation, is what we call kinship mechanisms. The kinship mechanisms, that is people coming from the same region, from the same village, from the same neighborhood, from which they have migrated to the larger cities, start playing a role in their new environment. The kinship mechanisms in Turkey are widespread. Let me give you another statistics. There are about 110,000 NGOs in Turkey, registered NGOs. About 1/3 of them are these kinship associations. So it is through the kinship associations that the newly arrived, unemployed and unemployable in many cases, individual within the kinship mechanism and within family ties and extended family ties is given the opportunity for employment, apprenticeship, employment, training within this new setup, and all the other social network mechanisms and support mechanisms. Now, particularly local governments in Turkey provide quite a lot of support to these associations, not individuals necessarily, to these associations to help with this job, to help them really to try to alleviate this problem. So there is also a historical aspect of it, because in many countries, in Europe that was the case, and in other parts of the world, the guilds used to play a similar role in the traditional societies. So my request from speakers is, are there, that's the question, similar mechanisms in your respective countries or mechanism that you know of, so that we can integrate it all together. One last point, we have not mentioned the role played by other mechanisms, political mechanisms particularly, in alleviation of this problem, particularly in reference to clientelism. Because through clientelism, you can also help the barefoot guy, okay? But in return for it, there is, of course, a demand for political support from the individual, from the family, etc. And in many of our countries, I'd like to think clientelism still plays an important role. Political favoritism, clientelism in trying to help either the individual poor or poor communities, but expecting political support in return. Thank you very much.
Robbie?
I'm Robin Lewis. Thank you very much. It's a wonderful panel. If there's a thread that runs through this, it's something that is perhaps still, to my mind, a central dilemma of public policy and of the study of public policy. And it's something we talked about yesterday. For those of you who, last 2 days, those of you who weren't there over the last 2 days, we've had a student workshop with students from all of these countries in attendance. So we already got a start on this. And there are many ways you could put this dilemma. One way I put it yesterday was theory versus practice. You all are putting it in terms of, well, for instance, Andre, norms versus practices, rhetoric versus reality. And that seems to be the gap that still has to be bridged. It's not that there's not progress. If you look at the norms of 20 and 30 years ago, inclusivity wasn't really there. Now it is. Sustainability wasn't there. Now it is. So that's a movement forward in a positive way, but the next step is the hardest. And I was curious to think about the variances across countries, not just on the stage, but also in the audience, in terms of implementation mechanisms. It strikes me that one of the most effective implementation systems, because we were talking the other day about systems approach to policy problems, is China. And in the case of China, the success story, which is tangible, which is very real, seems to me to be in the area of government and the way government functions, in that there is a chain of accountability that goes straight to the top. It's both bottom up and top down at the same time, that officials at the most remote locations in the most local settings have a chain of accountability and have some pretty hard indicators that they have to answer to. So that's a real, and perhaps Professor Chu can say a little bit more about how that works, because it's quite unique. I don't see that operationally successful in many other places, including my own country. On the other hand, perhaps a weakness in China, and maybe a strength in other places, is the interfacing, something that Pratik was certainly emphasizing, the interface between different sectors. Civil society is weak in China. The private sector is growing fast, but doesn't get into the, always get into the dialogue and into the interaction with government successfully. So there are different pathways toward successful implementation, successful policy that have to be explored. In the end, I mean, I'm always apologizing to my own students because they've heard this before, but you know, it seems to me in the end, public policy is at the same moment enormously complex and also very simple. And on the simple side, I say that public policy asks 4 questions. It asks what works, what doesn't work, why do they work and not work, and then it should ask, but often forgets to, the most important question, which is what works here. And that is something you've all addressed, which is context and the importance of culture, of various mechanisms that have been invented. Professor Chu referred to Japanese culture, for instance, being interesting and successful in some ways, but not necessarily replicable in other settings because of the uniqueness of Japanese culture. So that's a complex of questions I'd love to hear more thoughts on from our wonderful panel. Thanks.
Thank you, Robin, very much. I'd like to make a question.
Hello, good morning. Michael Carlin, author of the Caring for Our Future project, which did the systemic part of monetary economics of the Millennium Development Goals. I'd like to, more or less, rather than ask questions, but on solution issues for people to debate and think about, because we're talking about integration, But we can't do integration if we do not recognize the consequences and the criteria that we need to make systemically capacitating monetary economics that function for fiscal, social, environmental capacitation of society. And we have, where we go back into politics, which I'll come to in a minute, local politics, cultural politics, the human id, and how we react to things, what we do in modern terms, we need to have criteria and methods. And through about, I don't know how many hundreds of conferences at the UN with very intelligent people in many countries and businesses, and I'm very honored to be here at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, which is very active in getting the right people to the right places and doing a lot of good here in difficult terms. I look at solutions have to start at the root causal factors. It's the most difficult side is how we deal with human nature. But there are, if we look at all the disciplines, all the life science knowledge, we will find that that's where, in many factors, that is where we came from. So if we don't know what we are in biosystemic terms as living creatures, there's no way that we're going to understand how we best moderate, how we best treat others, what we should eat, what we shouldn't eat, what we should do, and how society is structured. We work on a completely randomic, almost, set of consumption of basic needs without really thinking, what is the impact of having, let's go into infrastructure, for example. You had one, you have a huge dam put thousands of kilometers away from the market, and that costs millions, billions, and you leave the doors open for all kinds of manipulation, greed, and not really a modern business model, which means that electricity, for example, with smart grids and the internet opens a completely new focus. And the difficulty we seem to have, I know it because I learned it from myself. So the first judge was for me. And then I recognized that I wasn't alone. So I'd like just to put a few points, which I think this 2 days, if they can sort of think about it, what sounds crazy, what is okay, what the obstacles are, then we can make some process. It won't happen overnight. Thomas Edison had 1,000 lamp bulbs until he got one that worked, that functioned. So we just have to keep nailing the process. And when it comes to the word systemic, that was a dirty word 20 years ago, before the United Nations Millennium Declaration. And here in Brazil, they even talked about systemic corruption. So we should be talking about the positive things, not just the negative things. So I'd like to put these out. First of all, education. The whole educational system was designed to make people able to contribute to society, and when the Industrial Revolution came along, to do whatever the job required. And that enabled using the need to know psychology, which with the internet has become more difficult and less manageable, because people can ask questions as to why we have to do this, why is this polluting, why is this good or bad. And so I go here. I think the education side needs to start very young with shifting from linear understanding, how we do that, to linear, to associative, to integrative, to systemic, and then ultimately to what is the ancient science, which is a multidisciplinary science because it's biosystemic, of what is called, or was called, genometrics. Genometrics means you just don't exaggerate. You eat and drink as much as you like. And we have the brain mechanisms set into us from birth as to how to have the right amount. If you put if you need water, you focus and you drink just enough water for your requirements. But today we have water with taste and all the rest of it, and whiskey and a few other things, and we take too much of it. So we have to understand that, because that is the essence of the success of the consumer society, the increase in the quality of life of millions of people, but at a huge price, because they decided to use planned, calculated, energy and resource intensive production and consumption, and that simply reduced the life cycle of consumer goods and durables. We all know that, but it also took away the savings. It also took away the jobs with automation. Outsourced, millions of people entered the global economy, have a far better life today, but we're in a very fragile risk situation, because the economies are not generating primary liquidity in the sense of industrial or natural transformation. The profit margins in almost all industrial and extractive industries have gone to the financial intermediation, financing it. And so anybody who has, this country has got, I forget the statistics, if it's 40, 50%, 60% of people have credit card debts. And in Brazil, the profits have gone to the banking systems, and it went to the commodity markets. I want you to think, for example, a true practical example, why we need to address the way the monetary system is managed, the issues of M1, M2, M3, M4, which is primary liquidity, 1 and 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6, which is secondary liquidity. You can't just simply carry on dishing out secondary liquidity to make the economy work if the primary economy is made with automation and the people do not have the jobs and they don't have the income to sustain the quality of life that's been achieved. So how do we get from a mess to something that's got reasonably organized? And the first thing I would strongly put, we have to look at several points in their interactive means. First of all, our political electoral system, and how democracy is used simply is anachronistic, and it is distorted, and it doesn't obey the original origin of democracy, which came from tribal consensual plebiscite to making decisions, and then allocating tasks so that the tribe could survive. But our tribe today is more difficult to manage probably than it was a few thousand years ago. Yeah. And so let's get on with this. Education, linear thinking, as I mentioned, to systemic capacitation. The moment you start reducing the obsolescence of high value energy and resource intensive goods, you start creating savings, you start creating the ability of somebody to buy a motor car, let's say, for the sake of argument, or whatever, or a computer, and it can be redesigned, reintegrate the designs, re-optimized and repriced. The same way the entire economic, monetary cycle and life cycle of goods. So I'll just go through these. I'll go very, very quickly through these if you give me 2 minutes. Can I have 2 minutes?
Thank you very much.
I'll do my best. It's very...
Yes.
Okay.
We just had a number of very broad and challenging questions for not only the last two presenters, but for the whole table. So to keep the time of this session, I'd like to ask our colleagues from the panel to address the different questions. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay. Let me try to answer or share my idea with the two questions. One is by a Turkish colleague. Agree with you that the kinship association play a bigger role for social development, social equity. I think different societies, especially developing societies, have different models. Japan, I said, Japan is advanced society. Japan is really a a collective model. It's not just the family, not just a company, school, but within government, between government and the individual, between government and the private. So Newsweek 20 years ago used to define Japanese society with the title is the Japan in, the Japan whole country as in cooperation, work together to achieve a goal. So that's really general collective society works, the model. And others, family, Chinese collectivism is mainly focusing on family. Beyond the family, China is not quite a collective society. Chinese collectivism is strong in family. Family members care each other, help each other, organize a safety network for housing, medical care, and employment for each other. But going beyond the family, China does not have a strong collectivism as Japan has. So I don't know in Turkey and in others. Your question is about the political theories, a sort of corruption. Chinese practice, China has, the ruling party has developed the latter practice for decades. That in each local place, the #1 leader should not be from the local. The local province, Guangdong or Jiangsu, cities, counties, towns, the #1 person should not from the local. So it seems to workable. So this is not group of people you should take a special care, because you don't have a special relation with any group at the local when you are #1 leader. So that's model works in China. I don't know in other countries. Professor Lewis, your question, how does it work? How government implement its goal, equal, inclusive? I think all we political scientists know and read Francis Fukuyama's book, Political Order and Political Decay. He emphasized a strong state is important for countries' development, for everything. It's not just the democracy, not just the rule of law, but the strong state, the state capacity. And in this area, China has been a strong state. And Russia is a strong state too. But I see a difference between Russia, as you mentioned, and China, two big neighbors. I see like currently Russian under President Putin is a strong state in foreign policy. Ukraine, Syria, Middle East. In politics, not a strong state in economic and social development in Russia. And different from Russian, Chinese strong state, including Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, China is a strong state in both development and the distribution of housing. And China's strong state give a strong support to private sector in economic development, social market economy. And the Russian, as far as now, is not very much market economy. You see like now famous, the strong Chinese enterprise, most of them are private, Alibaba, WeChat, Tencent, Huawei, Zhongxin. They are private. They are famous in China, in the world. They are Fortune 500 companies. And the government supported them. So Chinese strong state in the area of both development and distribution healthy among people, especially poor people, and the strong state in infrastructure building. So let me stop it. Okay.
Okay, I'd like to
Just responding to Coral, I mean, in South Africa.
Speaking microphone.
Sorry, responding to Coral. In South Africa, I mean, it's an interesting question you asked, because I think it's dependent on how social capital, how thick it is, how thin it is. And one of the things is that with higher levels of poverty, is that social capital becomes eroded. So for instance, whereas you had like the kinship system in, what did you call it, the kinship, is that, for instance, in informal settlements, what would have happened was that that relatives would come from elsewhere and use the family home, or at least the relative's home, as a kind of foothold into the labor market and to the housing market. But now what's happening is that with higher levels of poverty is that they can't do that anymore. So what's happening is that you're getting migration of the more able and the not so poor into cities as opposed to the very poor. And then the other thing, just very quickly, is that there are things like saving societies, burial societies, stockfalls where they save as well, and so these societies do exist. I mean, but what is also happening though is that with increasing levels of poverty, is that there's also levels of gangsterism entering in this. So I mean, you know, I'd keep a gun in my house, a hot piece of gun in my house, and in return, then I'll put bread on your table. You know, so that's the kind of negative social capital that's also featured. I mean, on that point on.
Yeah, I just want to add also in terms of the kinship mechanisms that in these countries that I study, and I thought it was very interesting the points that you made in relation to Turkey. In the cases that I know about, there are these what are called the informal mechanisms of social protection. There are the traditional ones, and the ones that have existed for a very long time in these societies. In fact, there is an article that I find it's very interesting. The name of it is social protection is thousands of years old. So it's not social protection is not something new. It's something that has existed for a very long time. And the problem is that instead of trying to create these social protection mechanisms using these traditional ones that exist, most of the development of social protection structures that are implemented are different, and sometimes one undermines the other. So because of all the different the changes that these societies have, and all the migration from the rural areas to the urban areas, it changes the dynamics of the society, and as a consequence, these informal or these traditional systems of social protection, they stop existing, and then in the place you have these formal structures of social protection that have so many flaws to be implemented. So yes, I think that one solution or one alternative would be to try to find ways where you can implement formal social protection structures, but using the basis of these informal social protection structures that exist there, and not contradicting or opposing them.
Okay. Still have time for a couple of questions, if any. No? Are you hungry? So, otherwise, I think we can close our session here, this panel, and invite you for the next panel at 2 o'clock sharp. And thank you very much for the audience and my colleagues at this panel. Thank you. Thank you. Vocês vão almoçar conosco? O restaurante vem aqui do lado.